there's some question of whether we can do it, we can,
Yeah,
but to
exactly.
say it's locked in.
Yeah,
It's not.
I don't think they're saying that.
Oh, okay, I mean, if it's a matter of, hey, you know, can we do it, and there's a legitimate reason, we can negotiate it with them and do a written agreement to do
Got
it.
a couple of ordinances here.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Washougal City Council meeting for October 3rd, 2011, and ask that you please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Forsberg, could you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Coaston.
Here.
Councilmember Shoemaker. Councilmember McDaniel.
Here.
Councilmember Delavar.
Present.
Councilmember Greenlee.
Here.
Councilmember Morris.
Here.
And Councilmember Russell.
Here.
Councilmember Shoemaker has asked to be excused for this evening.
So move.
Second. Got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Our first item on the agenda this evening is swearing in of one of our newest reserve officers. Officer Govin, would you meet me up front, please? Oh, they give you copies as well? Cool. Please raise your right hand. I, Robert Govin,
I, Robert Govitt,
do solemnly swear that I am a citizen of the United States
do solemnly swear that I am a citizen of the United States
and of the state of Washington,
and of the state of Washington,
that I will support the Constitution and laws of the United States
that I will support the Constitution and laws of the United States
and the Constitution and laws of the state of Washington,
and the Constitution and laws of the state of Washington,
and will, to the best of my judgment, skill, and ability,
and will, to the best of my judgment, skill, and ability,
truly, faithfully, diligently,
truly, faithfully, diligently,
and impartially perform the duties of the office of Reserve Police Officer
and impartially will perform the duties of a reserve officer
in and for the city of Washougal,
in and for the city of Washougal,
Clark County, Washington,
Washington,
as such duties are prescribed by law,
as such duties are prescribed by law,
so help me God.
so help me God.
Congratulations, welcome. I'll have Jennifer get these over a little bit later. And they're gone just that quick. Be safe. I'm glad it was a short oath. Okay, are there any amendments to the agenda this evening? Hearing none, do we have any correspondence?
None.
Okay. And do we have any members of the public that would like to address the council this evening? Good evening, Don.
Hello. Don Bowen, 32934 Southeast 20th Street. And what I wanted to talk about, I've been attending the meetings for a while now, and I know you're looking at your processes and procedures. As I understand, you're going to have a workshop on that. One of the things I'd like to have you look at would be allowing council members, when they're in absence, a proxy. One of the things that bothers me is that, well, it doesn't bother me. Most of the issues that you people are addressing have been looked at with the entire council for a long period of time. And when persons can't leave a proxy with specific instructions or anything, then they really don't get to count. And I don't think that's appropriate. And as you well know, that's the way it's done in business, is a board of directors meeting. If you've been working a project, your vote always counts. So when you're looking at your workshop, I'd like to see you take a look at providing proxies to the council members. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Any other members of the public wishing to address council? Okay, this evening we have one of our only items on the main agenda, a consent agenda that consists of 8 items. Our council minutes from September 6th, 2011 and September 19th. Our workshop minutes from September 12th and September 26th. Our regular accounts payable claims in the amount of $1,177,511.46. Agenda Bill 120-11, a supplemental professional services agreement number 2 with PB Americas. Agenda Bill 12111, a professional service agreement with the Resource Company. Agenda Bill 12211, a professional service agreement with Wallace Engineering. Agenda Bill 12311, Public Works Trust Fund Construction Loan Agreement. And Agenda Bill 12411, the Public Works Trust Fund Construction Loan Agreement.
Mr. Mayor, I ask unanimous consent that we approve the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor, I object.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I request that we remove item number 4 for discussion.
Okay. Any other changes?
And let's see, number 6 as well.
Items 4 and 6.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I ask unanimous consent that we approve the consent agenda items number 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and 8.
Second.
I've got a motion and a second. Council discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Item number 4, Agenda Bill 120-11, a supplemental professional services agreement number 2 from PB Americas for the 2010 Transportation Capital Facilities Plan update. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you, Your Honor. Staff is submitting SPSA number 2 from Parsons Brinkerhoff Americas for the 2010 Transportation Capital Facility Plan update. On 8/23/2011, the Washougal Planning Commission recommended that the traffic impact fees be set at a rate of $260 rather than the current plan outlined rate of $392. Parsons Brinkerhoff Americas was asked to extend their efforts to better inform the Planning Commission as to how the currently proposed rate came about and what impacts the rate change to $260 will have on the city's transportation infrastructure. New tasking will include additional phone conferencing, additional findings, and presentation of the new work at an additional Planning Commission work session and public hearing. Recommended action is to authorize the mayor to sign the Parsons Brinkerhoff Americas Supplemental Professional Service Agreement number 2 for the 2010 Transportation Capital Facility Plan update.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we authorize the mayor to sign the Parsons Brinkerhoff Americas Supplemental Professional Services Agreement number 2 for the 2010 Transportation Capital Facility Plan update.
Second.
I've got a motion and a second to authorize the mayor to sign the PB Americas Supplemental Professional Services Agreement number 2 for the 2010 Transportation Capital Facility Plan update. Council discussion. Michael?
Thank you. Before I go into any discussion, I understand that Council Member McDaniel also had a question, and I'd like to have her ask her question first.
Great. One of my questions is, did the Planning Commission request this particular item? And when
No,
they were discussing the rate?
No, the Planning Commission did not request the rework. The Planning Commission changed the rate, and so it was, is what happened is we looked at the rework, and we went back to Parsons Brinkerhoff, and there would be substantial work to change the TIF rate from the 393 to the 260, because you have to get into level of service criteria, projects. It's quite an involved process.
I see. So can you tell us a little bit how the Planning Commission arrived at this number that they've come back to us with?
The reason the Planning Commission arrived at this number is they wanted a comparable TIF rate with neighboring jurisdictions, specifically Camas.
Do we know Camus's TIF rate?
Yeah, I have it here. It's very close to the $260. It is $277 at this time.
So I'm assuming then that the Planning Commission is looking at being competitive with our neighbor in the TIF rate?
I believe that was their intent.
Okay. I'm just curious to know, do we not already have all of this information as far as how the TIF rate is set and, you know, what it pays for and all of that sort of thing? I'm just trying to figure out why the supplemental for this particular project.
Well, the TIF rate basically is used as part of a match for future projects. And so if that gets adjusted lower or higher, it'll have significant impact on the whole capital facilities plan. Some projects may be able to be built. Level of service might change at certain intersections if we have a lower level of service. It has to do with the Growth Management Act. There's quite a bit that goes into it as far as adjusting TIF rates and modeling for future scenarios, future populations, things of that nature.
And the budget, you say it's budgeted, but yet it's a new supplemental? Is it just coming out of the Transportation Capital Facility Plan Fund?
Right, it would be coming out of the transportation fund, that's correct.
Transportation Fund.
Right.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Mr. Mayor. So I want to clarify a couple of things. Does the Planning Commission set the rate for the TIF? Okay, so they recommend it to the council, and the council then sets the rate. And that's what I thought happened here. Do you know well, first off, with the modeling of the TIF, I understand that there's a discussion about how, sort of like the Laffer curve, you know, you reduce rates, you raise rates, it changes how much you have total coming into the city and what type of funds are dedicated for what projects. And there are a lot of assumptions that go into that. With the modeling that we're asking PB Americas to do they have, or have they told you that they have any method to account for the number of businesses that would come in here if we had reduced the rate versus simply just we make the assumption that they do come in, or, you know, use historical modeling alone? Do you know if they deal with that at all?
Yeah, I think that's something we discussed. It's difficult, obviously, to quantify. You know, if you lower the rate, do businesses move in? Do you build the infrastructure? Do businesses move in? So it's a difficult exercise to try to make those conjectures, especially in the economic environment we're in.
The reason I ask is because there was something that sort of didn't sit well with me when I first heard the phrase that after they made the recommendation that we want to have this contract to have this company come in and tell them how they're wrong about their recommendation. You know, we just need to keep informing them until they finally come up to our answer. And there's something I completely can understand that.
Michael, just a moment. Jim, we're not attempting
No.
to tell the Planning Commission they're wrong.
No, I don't ever remember hearing that. There is consequences to adjusting that TIF rate. The whole model will be able to reflect those adjustments. We'll look at level of service. Like I say, we have basically a D level of service. I don't want to get into all the details of level of service here, but there are going to be adjustments that need to be made to the capital facility plan, like any budget. If you don't have the revenue or the amount of revenue that you thought initially going into a capital facility plan, then you're going to have to make adjustments one way or the other. So that's what
Right.
we're looking at. We're going to go back to them and let them know basically what happens to the capital facility plan if these TIF rates are adjusted downward.
So if I could ask a couple more questions about that specifically. When we're talking about the TIF rate and the effect of the TIF rate, I can understand when we're talking about the fund that these TIF rates go into. And for those people who may not be aware of what exactly we're talking about for the traffic impact fees, the rate of $260 versus the rate of $392 is, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the rate per trip for the vehicles coming into or out of a business or residential unit, but mainly
That's
we're
correct.
talking about businesses that are the main issue.
Residential and businesses as well.
Right, but the big impact is going to be businesses because they
Correct.
have 50, hundreds, multiple hundreds of business or trips per day versus business or residents presumed to be just a handful. Right?
But I think if you calculate in a development, so to speak, there could be some impact.
Okay, sure. Okay, certainly. But when we're talking about the traffic impact fee, it's a one-time fee that's paid when people first first build or improve or remodel, fitting certain criteria, a property. And then once that fee has been paid, then it's never revisited for that property until they remodel again or change significantly across some sort of
Right.
metric.
If their use changed and it generated more trips.
Right, exactly. So on some level, this is simply a one-time impact fee, but getting back to what we were talking about earlier, once the TIF is changed, my understanding so far is that really what changes is how much money is collected and how much we can project based on how many, remodels we expect, new business startups we expect. That's really the modeling what we're talking about, or is there something else as well with regards to other jurisdictions looking at our TIF rate? Do you know?
Well, I think the modeling, a lot of what drives the TIF rate is the amount of trips that are generated, like we discussed. If you do a population model into the future, with some accuracy, if you use a model, you can look at the generated trips in 2030. So to build the facilities that you will need to accommodate the extra traffic on the road, the TIF rate is an important piece of that, because that's a match to some of the grants that we go after. If we wanted to, say, the 27th Street Extension Railroad Overpass, if we wanted to apply for a grant, generally speaking, a TIF is required as a match for a grant of that nature. So,
Would it be not possible, or would it be possible at all to have matching funds from the general fund, or is that not allowed?
David, do you want to take that one?
I saw David grabbing the mic there.
We could fund our transportation capital facilities plan any way we would like, other than using utility funds or any other funds that are otherwise restricted. We could pay for it exclusively with our own funds, if you would, without any grants. That would be a daunting undertaking for this community. And so, as you know, leveraging grants, federal and state appropriations for transportation infrastructure is how we fund even local transportation projects. To score highly in that competitive process, there are certain benchmarks for how you match the grant dollars, and they vary depending upon exactly which appropriation you're working with. But what's called private match can be weighted fairly heavily. And in fact, when we had the conversation recently about getting some design work and applying for the grant out at East Street and 27th to upgrade the intersection for larger trucks, we were talking about private match and making sure that we had set aside. So you get public match, which is our general fund dollars, and then you bring private money, which is TIF money because it's paid by the private sector. And they'll have thresholds. And so you want to, as a community, you want to meet the thresholds that give you the opportunity to score the highest so that you can leverage those grant dollars to the maximum. You may not have to have any TIF dollars. You might be able to approach those applications with no private match, but I would submit that you probably wouldn't be successful in that competitive process. or there may be minimums. I think there are some, depending on which one you're talking about, there are some minimums you have to have. So the conundrum with the TIF is that there's a notion out there, if we lower it, we'll get more. If we lower the TIF rate, we will get more TIF money than if we had had a higher TIF rate. And I think you asked if there was some calculus out there that we could rely upon that would give us a nexus between lowering the rate and what we could anticipate in enhanced revenues, and there isn't. And so the methodology that not that we're aware of or the consulting community is aware of, that economic analysis hasn't occurred. So we basically take the plan, it's a multi-factored plan, and when you change one of the factors in that multi-factored plan, it impacts the entire system. And PB wasn't scoped to iterate their analysis. They were scoped to do one analysis and come up with an answer, and that answer was the recommended rate. The Planning Commission, for the reasons that have been stated, would like to see potentially a different rate, and they're advising you of that. That changes that whole system, and so we have to be compliant. Our capital facilities plan has to comply with the GMA around levels of service and a number of different things. So this request, frankly, is for us to be responsive to the Planning Commission's desire to use a lower rate and to go back into the system and make the adjustments to accommodate the lower rate and understand those implications, so we have a compliant capital facilities plan that we can then bring to you as their recommendation. And they weren't scoped to do that iteration, and unfortunately that iteration is almost $10,000 of consulting work.
First, I want to explain to the room what impact fees are about. The reason that we have impact fees is so that when a new development comes to town, a developer, and that development needs new roads and new parks and new fire capacity and so forth, that the developer pays for that instead of you. If the developer doesn't pay for it, then the people who already are in the city have to pay for it. The costs of providing the Growth Management Act, which was mentioned briefly, has a set of standards, some of which are set at state level, some of which are set at county level, which go under the term of art, what is it, something of service?
Concurrency.
Well, concurrency and level of service. If the level of service or concurrency drops below a certain point, then the city is put into a moratorium in which they cannot allow further development. This is a very complicated calculation to do. I understand full well what the Planning Commission was thinking, but there's another piece of information that they and most of us are not aware of. I'll let Administrator Scott explain a little bit, but Camas at this point is looking at, has not yet passed, but they're further along than we are, a system of credits and deferrals for impact fees, particularly transportation impact fees, that are based on a return of sales tax or property tax revenue. So if a company comes in and generates lots of sales tax revenue, part of that sales tax can, in effect, pay for their transportation impact fees, among other things. Is there anything you'd like to add to that about what they're doing, or where? I just learned today that Mitch Knipe, our acting community development director, is working on this also.
I would just add that we currently have what's called a business enhancement factor, which looks at sales tax that's generated, and if certain thresholds are met, there's a deferral, and potentially, and then credit for some of the impact fees that would be normally assessed against a property. And it's in recognition of the revenue generating capacity of a particular type of project, but it's limited to sales tax, and there's certain thresholds. Both Camas and Washougal are looking at furthering the scope of that to include property tax, as you mentioned. And so we're working out how to blend the new policy initiative with our existing business enhancement factor. Camas does not have, I understand from Mitch, a business enhancement factor that's similar to ours. The general concept is, do you target those specific types of businesses and industries that are stimulating to the local economy, if you would, with a credit program that's more targeted? Or perhaps do you take a policy approach that looks at lowering that threshold across the board just in the flat rate of the TIF, or some combination of the two? And that's really the policy conversation that needs to occur. And unfortunately, the timing of our capital facilities plan update, because I think we have to be done by the end of the year, and the effort on this other policy initiative aren't perfectly coincident in terms of the timing. But it is important to note that we are working on a policy that targets those types of projects that stimulate the local economy, and to look at credits. The thing that's important there too, though, is that part of that incremental increase in revenue to the local government, to us, goes back into the capital fund. So, because if you credit away all of the TIF, then you are not able to have private match, and that's the current way that the landscape is. Until that changes, we really need to have private match to be able to compete. I think it's a good policy. I look forward to having the Planning Commission and the Council consider that. In the meantime, I guess what's before you tonight is should we take a look at closely at what the Planning Commission has suggested, and that is to not go to the full 390 that came out of that plan, and see what the implications are of doing the 260, and if so, we're just submitting that we need a little bit more help from our consultants so that there's a full package for you to consider. Another approach would be to say, hey, you know, we ran the model, and this is the number that came out, and so as a council you want to consider that. We would not have to iterate back with the consultant to have any further work, because that's packaged. But we felt that it was our responsibility to represent what the Planning Commission was bringing forward to you and have complete data for you.
And then one more question. What's the present rate?
Present rate is...
Have it here. An update. Washougal current rate is $228.
John?
What is Camus's rate one more time?
272.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Camus's rate one more time?
Camus's rate at present time is $277. I think it's important to note they are in the process of updating their rate as well.
I think one of the things that
Updating, not necessarily increasing, but updating. right?
Updating.
Okay.
one thing that I understand, Jim, that they were looking at is some communities have more than one traffic impact fee zone, and they isolate different parts of their community based upon the transportation facilities needs in those different areas. Washougal just is one big zone. Vancouver, for example, has quite a few. I think Camas is looking at having two now.
Two.
So what might end up happening is that they'll isolate the area that has the most facilities needs and have a fee for that area without the other parts of the community that are already served having to sort of, if you would, subsidize the other part. That's the weakness of having only one area. We're pretty small though, so it kind of everything feeds to everything. But we might get to the point where we would want to consider something like that too, where you have different rates depending on where you're at.
And the follow-up question to that is, at that rate of 277, we know that Camas does get grant money for their transportation needs, right? At that rate?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. The next question I have is, how much in impact fees and transportation impact fees did we bring in last year, or in the last year? So we could just know what kind of money we're talking.
Might take us a moment just to research that.
Rod, you had a question?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to what John just said, and that's about what's projected, I guess, for 2011, 2012, because it looks to me like we're going to spend $9,000 plus to determine what that fee should be, but we may be talking about spending $9,000 on something that we got $900 last year for. I don't mean, whatever that number is.
Yeah, and our expenditure to support our capital facilities plan cannot come from the TIF funds, interestingly. We are mandated to have our capital facilities plan for all of our infrastructure, but here we're talking about transportation. We are mandated by the state under the GMA to have updates to our capital facilities plan at various intervals, and that is classically generally funded by communities. So the entire community pays for that, not new development. And yes, one of the chores that we're mandated to do is to have that TIF rate and to have a rational basis for the rate. Different communities have different rates because they have different capital facilities needs. There's probably, the formula isn't sacred in the sense that the number that comes out can't have some variance to it. There's a range to that. And the question is this 260 within that range, or would we have to otherwise adjust our plan in terms of timing? So it's hard to go apples to apples. However, it is important to do that. I appreciate the sense of comparability. It is one factor.
I really appreciate the explanations that you've given, because I'll be voting for this bill tonight. I think it's important to have the full data so that the Planning Commission can understand the impact, especially as it didn't understand the history behind, prior to this discussion, the history behind the changes from the current rate to the proposed rate to their recommended rate, and how that could definitely throw off a lot of the modeling that we have. So I'll be voting in favor of this tonight. But one question I have with regards to this is it possible to also ask them to, well, actually, it probably isn't possible, but do you know if PB Americas would be able to model what would happen if we eliminated the traffic impact fee? I know that sounds rather drastic, but I mean, when we're talking about bringing in revenues versus bringing in traffic impact fees, there is a certain amount that we will, of extra ongoing revenue that the city will bring in versus the one-time fees. And do they have any method that you're aware of to estimate that?
Not that I'm aware of. I could, definitely ask the question and give you a follow-up.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Have you found a number yet?
Yes, we collected $40,500 in 2010. And we've budgeted in 11 for about $35,000.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. I don't mean to belabor this point too much, but do you have that broken down of how much of that was commercial and which was residential?
Just a minute.
She's fast.
I have a question while we're waiting, if that's all right. Wonderful. Can we go over the current rate again? Was it 228 or 280? I'm sorry. Can you just please tell me? That's what I thought. 228.
Our current
Our
rate?
current traffic impact fee, currently.
Yes, boy. Our current rate is $228.
Okay, and now the $392 rate, it says the current planned outline rate is $392, is that correct? That's something that will be increased from the $228 rate coming up shortly. We're going to
That
see
was
this.
the staff recommendation to the Planning Commission based on an update to the capital facilities plan and the modeling around meeting our level of service requirements for the trips that would be anticipated for growth out to
2030.
30. So you look at our comprehensive plan and what we have said the community potentially would look like in 2030. What are the transportation facilities necessary to provide the level of service that we've specified in this community? And then you put a funding scheme together for public, private, and grant dollars for all of your transportation projects that get you there for that vision out to 2030, and then they do their modeling and a rate comes out so that you can have the private match. So the previous plan didn't require as much private match, therefore could have a lower rate.
Jen, have you found it?
No, I might have to have Rose come help me. Do you know where it's at, Rose?
Rod?
I'm still a little bit stuck on this $9,000 expenditure that we're gonna send out. The 260 is already a raise compared to what we have existing. 392 came from staff to upgrade, and that's what your capital facility plan is based on.
Yeah.
I should say it came from staff, but the data and the information was through working with our consultant, but formally speaking, when we present to the Planning Commission, the consultant doesn't recommend it, the staff recommends it.
Right.
So if we would took the difference between the 260 and the 392, it's $132 difference. Maybe we just take the 260 and add 60 to it, and we forget about spending the $9,000 out of the general fund.
There may be, we could loop back if you want to postpone the decision potentially. We could loop back with PB and ask what that bandwidth of change lowering from 390 would be, where the model can accommodate it without major impact to the overall system that would require the reworking. There may be some bandwidth there because there are assumptions that inform it, where maybe there's a much lower cost. I would imagine it would require some effort, but this is from 390 down to 260 was a fairly significant change, and I think had fairly significant impacts into the system. We could have some more conversation with them about something that would be different and try to reduce that cost. But without their help, they've built this model. They're really the ones that turn the key to crunch the model.
So the 9,000 really does need to be spent, because anytime you adjust that number, it has multiple effects on other.
Correct.
It has implications that we have to be in
We
compliance.
can't just add 260 and be all happy and
Correct.
go
And in
lucky,
fact-
but
You would
we
still
have to go through that.
Yes.
You'd still have to
exercise.
justify that number as well.
Right.
Do we know what the dollar amount potentially could be from PV Americas to rework the system? Not this number, but if we just throw out a number of $300 or the 260 that the Planning Commission has put out there and has recommended to council, what potentially is the cost from PV Americas to go back through and make that work and hand us back a capital facilities plan that reasonably gets funded through that?
We'd have to ask them. We haven't asked them to do
Move
that.
to table until we get that information.
I know you're on a
Second.
timeframe, though, I understand at the end of the year, so.
That's my next question, is how
Wait.
backed up are they?
Yeah, we have to have public hearings, go through planning commission, and so it's.
Withdraw my motion.
We may be able to get a letter of extension, but we do have some grants already in place that, could be impacted.
One-
So I'd have to find out.
John?
Mr. Mayor, I completely can see the value of doing this. My concern is that we're proceeding on hiring consultants based on assumptions that we are going to increase these fees to begin with. And that may not be the case. And so I'll be voting just against this because I think that the assumptions that are being brought forward are not assumptions that I share.
I just want to observe, John, that this number is based not on last year's capital facilities plan, but the new plan going forward, which includes in it a lot of work on SR 14, 27th, 32nd, Stiles Road, that whole complex of bringing transportation services to the northeast corner of the city, which is where the county has placed our industrial land. And that those things were not on the capital facilities plan at the old rate. That there are a number of new things on the capital facilities plan that have to be paid for by the development up in that corner of the city. And so this is, it's really apples and oranges to compare last year's number to this year's number because they're completely different transportation facilities plans.
Well, yeah, when I first heard you say 228, I heard it as 288, so I thought that they were lowering, they were recommending the lower rate, so that was my mistake there for being happy about that. However, once again, there's something that I hear different angles of this discussion, and I'm getting a little confused about different angles of this. When we're talking about our capital facilities plan, it's based off the assumption that the TIF fees go into a pot and that we have these projects on the list that we're going to pay for, and this money must, I mean, one thing we know about this pot of money is that it must be spent on capital improvements. That much we know. But how much money the city spends total, as you mentioned earlier, can be a lot more, and very often is a lot more. So when we talk about scoring, to the best of your knowledge, any of you that know the intricate details of the scoring, when it comes to scoring, and they look at our finances of the city, if we have dedicated in our budget in the future having X number of dollars from the general fund act as capital improvement dollars, will they treat those as if they were TIF fees?
It's I believe it's undetermined. Our last grant application for the surface improvements at Washougal, or I'm sorry, at 32nd Street and E, there were actually TIF that was identified in the grant application. So there were some public funds as well, but TIF was identified in that grant application. So.
When you say identified by the people granting the money? So in other words, they say we need to have TIF funds to cover this percentage of this project in order to get this money?
Yeah, the application comes with criteria by which they score. And so as an applicant for a grant, you look at that criteria and you seek to maximize your scoring. And so they indicate what the minimum private match is on a percentage basis, and they indicate what the percentage is that will give you the maximum scoring. So for example, I think the minimum was 10% in that for that project, and you got maximum scoring if it was a percentage higher than that. But if you brought to the table even more TIF, it didn't get you any more points, so you would keep that back and use it on another project. I'm not aware that you can identify other funds that don't meet their criteria for being private and still get the same scoring. The only time something like that could come up would be after the fact, because you prospectively identify revenues, and they understand that you're prospectively identifying what will come in the revenue stream for TIF over time, because you're applying you know, for projects that take some time to develop and to plan and develop. And if that doesn't come to fruition, and when it comes time for them to disperse, and you don't have the match in real time, I don't believe they shut your project down. You must be able to, but we've never experienced that, so I have no personal experience of how that would work. I've never experienced that, but that's a possibility where you wouldn't have the TIF then, after the fact.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the only other, and certainly is no guarantee, and that's why there's no easy answer to your question, can you substitute one for the other? Probably the only, if you wanted explanation, if you had to put 0 out there for transportation impact fees, is if you adequately have a transportation impact fee in place that you're charging, but you have just used exorbitant numbers of it for another project out there that didn't take grant dollars or something else. If we were spending $2 million on East Street and completely wiped out, which we haven't spent $2 million, but we pretty much completely wiped out our transportation impact fees on that project. And, you know, you may get some hope of some leniency with those folks doing the scoring in that by saying, we do have all that in place. We are reasonably doing what the GMA asked us to do and finding all these other funding mechanisms. The fact is, we have just spent it all on a major project within the same zone area. But there's no guarantee that they're gonna even give that any scoring weight either.
Do you know how often that's a factor?
I'm not aware of a transportation funding mechanism that doesn't have the private match. There's been some very specific types of grants that might not, so for pedestrian and bike improvements, I think, that didn't have that, but
It didn't require a match, yeah.
I think, but
Safe routes.
safe routes,
CDBG.
right? So there's those types, but the classic Federal Highway Administration type grants that come down through the state, this is the context. Most of the projects that are on the list through the RTC and on the current list that the region brings to the state level are all in that kind of mix. It is this is a classic policy dilemma for a community, is the public-private share of how we pay for our transportation infrastructure, and what is the right mechanism to fund that, and how do we encourage economic development while at the same time making sure that we can have it by having a transportation, having capacity in our transportation system. It's very difficult. There have been some different runs at trying to have a different means altogether, to not have TIFs at all, that got tossed into the legislature. You know, they've come up from time to time looking at, mostly it came from the development community, looking to have the burden of that private share spread out among all constituents within a community, as opposed to the newcomers through TIF or new businesses. And they look at different charges on real estate transactions, for example, was one that was going to supplant TIFs, and we'd all pay on real estate transactions, because then that would be new people and all the rest of us. It's just been hard, I guess, for the legislature to get their hands around this issue.
John?
Mr. Mayor and staff, I would feel more comfortable having this conversation if we did have that discussion of credits and deferrals with it. To me, that would make, it would at least give us some more carrots in our bag. And
Makes sense.
so, I mean, so when I'm looking at a full package, I don't know how far along you guys are on that discussion of deferrals and credits, but
I think we can. I appreciate that suggestion, Counselor, and I think that makes the most sense. And we are doing the credit one in-house because it's not systemic, if you would. It's got some implications, but we think that we can do that in-house, and Mitch is taking the lead on that. So what we can commit to would be to, if it's your pleasure to approve this supplemental professional services agreement, we'll continue to carry on with PB on the rate that's generally applied, so that we have all the data for you. But we will commit that when we come to workshop, and then for your action, that will package in the enhancement to the business enhancement factor. So you've got the entire TIF equation, if you would, in front of you. And we'll just make sure that that happens for you.
Other questions from council?
Mr. Mayor. So right now, the supplement one says that we are going to have them model three numbers. The number that staff recommended, which ultimately they recommended, the midpoint 325, the TIF rate of 260, which is their current recommendation. Is it possible, or do you know how much of an extra cost it might be to or I wonder if it's possible to find out, to have them model it at 228, which is our current rate? In other words, I mean, and if they model it like that, is that work that has already been done? Do you know?
Well, the projects on the list, are fairly expensive, when you have the grade separated crossing, and then there's an inflation factor that's built in. The capital facility plan is updated every 5 years, so that changes, and that's why these numbers kind of changed and why the numbers increased actually. I could definitely talk to them and see what that would be. With this supplemental service agreement, they're looking at a midpoint as well at $325. We wanted to add that in as a contingency. Hopefully that answered your question, Councilman.
Yeah.
Any other questions from council? Okay, I've got a motion and a second to authorize the mayor to sign the PB America's Supplemental Professional Services Agreement Number 2 for the 2010 Capital Facilities Plan Update. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
Motion carries. And Agenda Bill 12211, Professional Services Agreement from Wallace Engineering for the Campen Creek Culverts Replacement Project Pre-Design. Mr. Dunn.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Staff is submitting a PSA from Wallace Engineering for the pre-design phase of the Campen Creek Culvert Replacement Project. 3 culverts along J Street and M Street were identified as deficient, requiring upgrades to the corrugated metal culverts identified in the 2010 Comprehensive Stormwater Plan. This scope identifies the surveying, preliminary design, and environmental permitting that are the preliminary steps necessary to upgrading these facilities. Recommended action is to authorize the mayor to sign the Wallace Engineering Professional Service Agreement for the pre-design phase of the Campen Creek culverts. Excuse me.
So move.
Second.
Got a motion and a second to authorize the mayor to sign the Wallace Engineering Professional Services Agreement for the pre-design phase of the Campen Creek. Council discussion. Michael?
Mr. Mayor, I do apologize about pulling this one item. I actually meant to pull a different item for discussion. Not that I'm expecting any fireworks over it. So with that, there's only one comment that I'll make about this, which I thought was interesting, and that is on page 3 of this Exhibit A, under biological evaluation. It actually says, in an effort to reduce costs for this task, TRC, that's the contracting company, will recycle a large portion of the information presented in the biological assessment for the W Street project, which was one of the other projects that we passed today. I just thought that was an interesting choice of words for them to say they're going to recycle it there. And I think what they mean to say is they're going to just use the other contract as part of it. But anyway, I have no objection to this.
Any other comments from council? Okay, I've got a motion and a second to authorize the mayor to sign the Wallace Engineering Professional Services Agreement for the pre-design phase of the Campen Creek. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Mr. Mayor, I have a question, and that is it possible to ask a question about, or to just have a small commentary or question, if you will, not commentary or speech or anything like that. Just want to ask a question about an item that we've already passed. Would that be possible? And specifically about 123-11.
We could probably easily do it just under council comments.
Okay.
Get to that point.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We're at that point in the agenda for any other comments from the public. Anyone else wishing to address council this evening? Okay. Seeing none, under the mayor's report, we have a kind of a pre-presentation on the proposed 2012 city budget. Mrs. Forsberg.
Mr. Mayor and Council, if you'll grant me just a few seconds to get this all switched over, I'd appreciate it.
Good evening, Paul.
Good evening. Do you want me to drive?
Yes. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Lewis to go through the first part as I hand out handouts.
It's okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. It's a pleasure to be with you again as you go initiate your 2012 budget discussions. As Jennifer said, and as the mayor stated, the presentation covers a preview of your 2012 budget. I'm going to be covering the first section, which is an update on the economic data, such as it is as of this fall. And that'll be followed by a presentation on the budget approach, the budget estimates, and then a closing with the next steps. The economic data update, if you've been reading the paper, reading the business section, or going online and looking at some of the economic data, you'll find that there's really no good news, but there's no bad news either. And I guess that's really the good news, is there's nothing really bad out there on the horizon, at least so far. The state's economists characterized it as muddling through, and I think that's fairly appropriate. And his forecast that he recently provided in September looked at 2013, 2014 as when there'd be some improvement in the state economy. And I think you'll see some of this data suggests that that's the same at local level as well. Beginning at the state level, this is a chart that I've shown you before. This is the Federal Reserve Board State Economic Index, and the Federal Reserve Board produces this for all 50 states on a monthly basis. This chart shows the index level for Washington State, that's the bars in the left-hand axis, and then the percentage change from month to month, which is the line in the right-hand axis. And as you can see, in August of 2011, the index is at 150 and a little bit, 0.2% increase over the month. And if you go back to the left, you'll see a year ago, in August 2010 at 147, and that's roughly a 2.1% increase year over year in total. But you can see the line graph shows really just sort of a bumping along the 0% line. So there really hasn't been any traction to growth in this economic index, which is designed to mimic the state gross domestic product. So there really hasn't been any significant increases. Every time it looks like we have some increases, there's a drop down to zero again. So there's really been a difficulty getting traction in terms of growth in the GDP. If you look at Oregon's index for this, I know that's come up before. Oregon's index was up actually 3.7% over the year versus 2.1% for Washington, but it's actually declined the last 2 months consecutively in Oregon, whereas Washington has shown 3 months of being positive. Coming down a little bit more locally, this graph shows the employment, Clark County employment and the unemployment rate in the county, again starting in January 2008 through August 2011. And you can see, looking at today's, the most recent statistics for August, total employment at 124,400 jobs. And those are jobs located in Clark County. That's not the number of employed people living in Clark County. There's an additional 60,000 or so that are employed in other locations. And that unemployment rate dropped from well over 12% down to 10.4% in August as well. And you can see just going back again, a year ago, the unemployment rate was at 13.7%. Number of jobs was at 124,200. So 200 more jobs in August of 2011 than August 2010, but still roughly 8,700 less, or 6.5% less than August 2008. So significantly lower levels of employment in the county and still high unemployment. Just for comparison purposes, the Washington unemployment rate in August was 8.9%, the US was 9.1. Okay. This is the initial unemployment claims. This gives us sort of a preview on how the employment market is going, essentially looking at how many jobs are being lost in Clark County. And you can see latest number at just over 2,000. These numbers are somewhat lower than the middle of the recession, but still somewhat higher than pre-recession numbers in 2008. But again, suggest not a significant number of layoffs happening in the local economy. This next graph looks at the median sales price and the number of sales in Clark County. This comes from the Washington State University Center for Real Estate Research. And you can see the trend. The bars in the left-hand axis are the median price. The line in the right-hand axis is the number of sales. And you can see the steady fall of the median sales price. Most recently, second data we have is the second quarter of 2011 at $190,400. That's $24,000, roughly $24,000 less than a year ago, roughly 11.1% decline. If you look at the fourth quarter 2010 versus the fourth quarter 2009, roughly a smaller drop, 3.2% drop, and that's one of the things we look at when we think about what's going to happen with assessed values. And you can see the sales are somewhat flat. They haven't dropped significantly. You can see the spike in sales in the second quarter of 2010. That was when the federal tax credits expired. There's a number of transactions that beat that deadline. Sticking with housing, looking at foreclosures, this data comes from RealtyTrack. The good news here is that there are fewer new foreclosures, significantly fewer new foreclosures, both in the county, and I'll show you Washougal on the next slide, but dropped almost half of where they were in 2010. The bad news is that the number of foreclosures on the market is significantly pulling down the sales prices. You can see the last bullet. The average sales price for the foreclosed homes, $171,000 in 2011, $195,000 in 2010, and that's countywide information. For Washougal, similar story in terms of new foreclosures, significantly reduced numbers in 2011 for August, 7 versus 39 in 2010, a much lower rate in terms of the total number of foreclosures. I didn't have comparable data, but in 2011, there's been a total of 104. My guess is that's significantly lower than it was last year. One more on residential activity, and this is really a more close indicator of the activity happening in the economic activity happening in the local market. This is the residential building permit activity. And you can see in the box in this graph, well, let me walk you through the green line is 2009, green line in the triangles, the blue line and the diamonds is 2010, and then the bars are 2011. So those are the current year months. In the box, it shows you year-to-date to September, we're already at 49 permits, 15 more than last year, actually 3 more than all of last year. We had 46 single-family residential building permits all of last year. We're at 49 through the third quarter of this year. And you can see April, big month this year. And the most recent data, September, still tracking somewhat lower than 2010. Translating, oops, let me, a couple other comments. If you look at the population growth, so if you're looking at roughly 1.5% growth in population, that translates to roughly 60 to 80 residential units, not all single family, but between single family and multifamily. So you can see that in 2009, 19 units, 2010, 46. The pullback in the real estate, single family residential development really isn't sustainable in terms of keeping up with the population growth, and so we expect these numbers to grow to some sort of sustainable number, and that would be in the 60 to 80 units total. Looking at the total permit valuation, both residential and commercial, you can see through September of 2011, we're already at where we were all of last year in 2010. So this is good news in terms of what we're looking at in terms of assessed values as well. This is an early indicator of what we can expect for assessed value growth as well. And again, 14.2 million. If you split this out between residential and commercial, it's roughly 11.8 million in residential and 2.4 million in commercial. This chart is really while the permit activity is close on the close information on the residential development, sales tax revenue is really your best local economic indicator that you have. And this data is collected, there's a 2-month lag between when this information shows up in your revenue stream and when the activity actually occurred. So the September sales is actually, sales tax revenue reflects sales that happened in July. And this chart is similar to the prior chart on the permit activity. The blue bars are 2011, and going, the green triangle line is 2010, the red square line is 2009, and the black line is 2008. And you can see a fairly close mirroring of the last 3 years, and they're all slightly lower than 2008. But year to date to September, we're at 725,000. Versus 711,000 through September of last year. It's roughly a 2% growth. Although one of the characteristics of this year is it's very bumpy. You can't really see it as much in these bars, but you can see in January significantly over 2010, roughly 20% above 2010. But if you look at April, it's 13% lower than last year. So it's been a year of having some months that are significantly ahead of last year and some months that are significantly behind and some that are right on, but in total, year to date, we're roughly 2% above where we were last year. And lastly, just to give you a snapshot on inflation, this chart shows you the consumer price index, all urban consumers for Portland, trending back for the last 10 years, with the first half of 2011 data at 2.6%. That's coming in just slightly above the last 10-year average of 2.5%. And you can see it's picked up significantly over the last 3 years. So that gives you an update on the state and local economy, sort of a preview for your budget deliberations. And I'll turn it over to Jennifer to walk you through the rest of it. Oops, you can get through there.
Yeah, so bend it. Thank you very much. Just to start off with the timeline, starting in about mid-July through September, we've been compiling the preliminary estimates. Again, it is still pretty early, especially since we don't get assessor data till the end of October, hopefully, if not the beginning of November. Today is a statutory requirement to provide a preliminary budget estimate for 2012, so we're meeting that deadline tonight, doing this presentation. But October 24th will be the first main workshop session for the budget, 2012 budget. That will include the mayor's message, and then the third quarter 2011 update as well will be presented at that time. So here is an estimate of where we're tracking for 2011. We are still waiting on third quarter data. And one of the anomalies with our expenditures is the transferring between funds. So what we wanted to do is break out the actual total revenues, total expenditures, and then when you isolate out the transfers where we're ending the year. As you can see in 2010, that adjusted surplus was roughly $325. And currently we're tracking to have an estimated surplus of $700,000 for 2011. Again, that's backing out the transfers. So when you actually take into account the transfers, we are decreasing fund balance slightly in the approved budget that we have, and but not as much as we had originally anticipated with moving that ER&R funding and the budget amendments. Our approach for 2012, obviously no new taxes. We will be presenting the banking of the 1% resolution as we did last year to provide future council the opportunity, should it arise, to have that as an option. We are estimating an 8% decline in AV, assessed values. Again, we don't have any final word from the assessor yet. We're just going off of Paul's expertise.
Yes.
So that could change, obviously, higher or lower by the time we approve the budget. We're doing conservative revenue estimates. We are optimistic, as we've shown with our building, but we don't want to get too overly optimistic and inflate the budget. So we are remaining conservative. We are continuing to use the EMS restricted fund to support those EMS approved expenditures in the fire operating budget. And we are using, or proposing, no use of reserves for operations for 2012. We constrained our baseline 2011 expenses. We're actually, our instructions to the department heads was to come in less than the budget for 2011 for 2012 to try to tighten the belt a little bit more. We do have 2 labor negotiations ongoing, IAFF and 307W, so those will be a factor, or could be a factor in changes throughout the end of the year. The Police Guild has an existing contract that we'll be implementing the details of that for the contract. And we are having the non-represented staff follow the Guild contract in respect to medical sharing and COLA. The expense side includes a 33% increase in PERS contribution from 5.31 to 707, and then roughly averaging all the different healthcare premiums, it's about 9% increase in healthcare. Some key investments that we are proposing in the 2012 budget is adding back a police officer position, continuing the implementation of the staffing changes made in 2011, the firefighting position, the city engineer, and then implementing the finance and administration changes that we discussed a few weeks ago. We also want to look to restore the building contingency fund and create a transportation projects fund. And we'll talk in more detail in a moment on those. So where are all these budget estimates coming in? Or what estimates are we using? Again, property taxes are $260,000 lower due to the rate cap and the AV drop. We're projecting a 99% collection rate. We're doing pretty well this year at 101. But we'll see what happens next year. And again, we're still waiting on our estimate from the assessor. That's a critical piece that we're still missing. The EMS levy is approximately $41,000 lower in 2011, or than 2011. Sales tax, roughly a 1.4% increase. Year to date, as Paul mentioned, is roughly 2% higher than 2010. We also adjusted the utility taxes based on rates and different events occurring. And then, of course, the approved rates for rate increases for the utilities factor into the utility tax for the general fund. We're also projecting a 3.7% decrease in state shared revenue, and that's as of the last legislative session, so that could change depending on what the state budget does. So we just have to remain flexible and fluid in those line items. We've set the development fees at 2011 estimates, so we're still remaining pretty conservative. But we still have an overall revenue increase of about 1.3% compared to the 2011 estimates, and 2% higher than the budget. So I'm sure you can all read this very well. Oh, actually, it's not too bad. So this is just the line item detail for the general and street revenues for comparing 2010 actual 2011 budget, where we expect 2011 to come in this year, and then the 2012 estimate. And as I mentioned, it's roughly 1.3% higher in revenue estimates for 2012. And the lid lift line item for that you see on 2012, the $310,000 would be a transfer from the Fund 125 for the allowable expenditures. The actual revenue that we receive in the EMS for the EMS lid lift gets lumped in with the general property taxes, and then we true it up at the end of the year which is where those transfers come into play. Here are the individual department expenses, department requests for 2012. Again, we'll go into more detail on the 24th for what is comprised of those, or if you have questions. But we're coming in, or estimating to come in at 1.8% lower than our actual estimated. As you can see, the 2011 budget is roughly 11.1 million. Our estimate for expenditures for 2011 is currently 10.3, and we've estimated 2012 to be even lower than that. So we are continuing to constrain expenses and tighten belts where appropriate. So where does that put us with our crystal ball for the future? We've done a couple scenarios here, just to reiterate that it is fluid. Obviously, we don't know what the future holds. So we kind of did a high and a low for future for 13 and 14. But for 10 and 11, you can see there's no operating deficits. That's when you factor in the transfers, excuse me, that you come into the decrease of fund balance. In 2012, with the estimates that we currently have, we are positive for the year. And then looking at 13 moving forward, as you can see, with a 4.5% growth factor and expenses, and then conservative revenue forecasting, those are the deficits that we would be looking at. And then on the flip side, if growth for expenditures is 2.5%, they're decreased, obviously, by the same factor.
I've got a question about that. In 2013, why does it drop to a $1,000 deficit?
We're changing comparing 2012 estimates to a 2.5% increase. So it would go from a 32,000 to a. So it's just putting different columns in for perspective of how fluid it really is, depending on the growth of expenditures. We've been successful in containing the growth of expenditures. We've been working really hard on that to try to contain them. So we're just trying to show that, they could go up to 4.5%, or they could stay at about 2.5%. It's all dependent upon.
I was just missed a point there. But
we kind of crammed them in there on the end. And then on the flip side, we don't know what revenues are going to do either. We're remaining pretty conservative with that as well. One thing, additional item to point out is the EMS restricted fund, or levied lid lift revenues are running out. I think we estimated for 12, we're going to have some carryover of prior years for collection, but that'll be gone in 13. And so that's another factor as to why those 13 and 14 are a bit higher, is we don't have the lid lift funds to support the EMS expenditures out of the general fund. Questions, comments? So some of the things that we're still analyzing are the support service cost allocation plan. Again, we're reviewing. Paul's working on our overall cost allocation plan. We are working on the phase 1, which is putting the true direct costs to the utilities. And then phase 2, we'll be looking at the entire plan on what should be allocated, what the allocation basis should be. So that could affect the bottom line when we come back to you on the 24th, or by the time we present the final budget in December. Same with the ER&R expenses and funding. We're still developing the plan. We currently have about $100,000. We currently have $100,000 built into the plan, or into the budget for 2012, and we're still ending on the positive 32,000. But is that enough or not to cover our future needs and to keep that plan sustaining? That's something that we're looking at, so that could affect the bottom line as well. We want to restore the building contingency fund. This isn't requesting going out for bond for new buildings. It's to help budget for roof repair, HVAC systems, ADA compliance for the future, just to have a fund for major building maintenance in the future. As everyone can see, most of our buildings are not brand new, so they do require maintenance for upkeep to ensure that they're in pristine order for the future. We also are going to work on creating the Transportation Projects Fund. We touched on this kind of a little bit earlier with the TIF funds, but it would be in support of the TIF funds to have additional local match to apply for grants and to have those projects that we could start building this fund operationally. That way we would have resources to use during those projects. And then reviewing additional unfunded city needs. I know at least in the Parks Department, there's several projects that they'd like to move forward on that we didn't see as an operating and maintenance, but more of a after the bottom line project. And so we're going to evaluate those and bring those forward to you as appropriate. So that's kind of the recap of the general and street fund. We'll move on to the utilities. We have the 3 utility funds: the water sewer operating, water sewer capital, stormwater, and they're all tracking appropriately with the 5-year plan that we put together in 2010. We're implementing the projects with the bond funds moving forward, and the rates are tracking appropriately. The rates are set to increase again, 13.5% for water, 26.5% for sewer in January. The stormwater will increase 14.5%. And then the staffing increases is with the shifting of the finance person, and then just reflecting the city engineer charges as well. We issued the bond in May to pay for the list of capital projects, $16 million, and we are tracking right along on those projects. The reservoir it's fun. I've got to watch the reservoir go up, so that's been my gauge on how we're doing. My daughter's asked, is there going to be another level, but they've capped it, so there must not be any additional levels. So those projects are progressing, and as you've seen around town, I'm sure they are moving right along. And we've budgeted those projects in the capital fund. So here's kind of the synopsis for the utility funds. So they're, again, these are the more boring funds. They're tracking right along. The next steps in the budget process, additional review we're waiting on input from the labor negotiations. Like I said, firefighters, IAFF, and 307W. We're waiting for our update with the assessed value. It's due October 31st, but I believe it was after that last year that we got it. But I've already been asking, do you have it yet? Do you have it yet? Because obviously that's a critical piece. We're going to put together and analyze the 3rd quarter data, and then finalize the ER&R plan, update the cost of service allocation plan, assess the building needs, and then review what matching funds would be necessary. We'll present the 2012 preliminary budget at the October 24th workshop, and that'll have the details for all the funds. Again, I just kind of stuck with the higher funds, but we do have additional funds with, again, the TIF fund and EMS, the hotel motel, all those restricted accounts as well that we'll bring forward. The document will be available for the public starting the 24th, and then we'll set the public hearings in November for both the property tax and the budget. And that's about it. With the building needs and the matching funds for transportation, one thing that we're considering presenting to the mayor is actually taking our reserves and delving them out so that there are buckets for different things, so that there's not just one big lump of additional reserves over our 16% policy, but to identify what should be used for the future in different areas. So that's kind of where those 2 additional needs are fitting in as well. And then that way we can take operationally and start funneling funds to those specific project funds as well. Again, knowing that they're general funds and could be swept back in the future, but just to give guidance on what projects to maintain and to move forward with is something that we're working on presenting. Pretty positive. We're working hard, and we will have more information on the 24th.
The 24th we'll be bringing forward, as Jennifer said, most of the detail of the budget itself. I think it's unfortunate, though, that in the way that the timing happens and statutorily the way some of the timing happens immediately after that, we're also going to give you a completely revised one, most likely, once the assessor gets done with their work, and in anticipation that we are not going to get anything before the 24th in order to have worked those. And those of you may remember last year we were well into November before we actually had those numbers. So once we have those, we'll make some adjustments and make some appropriate changes in there and flesh out another budget to you as well. Okay, do we have any items from council? Michael, you had an item on Agenda Bill 12311.
Actually, believe it or not, the presentation by Mr. Lewis actually answered one of my questions. So
excellent.
That was my question, and I have no further comments.
Other items from council?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
In case council and the mayor are not aware, but I'm sure you are because it's been in the news, our football team is amazing. And we very well could be looking at a state championship team. And so I'm going out on a limb. I'm calling it now. But what's not only exciting about that is also the younger players are playing a lot more too. So they're getting a lot of experience, which means we could be dominant for the next 2 or 3 seasons. So anyway, Washougal football.
Okay, other items from council, Paul?
I just wanted to mention that Public Works Committee went up and looked at the construction of Reservoir Number 4, which is up on the hill northeast of the city, outside the city limits. At the time we were there, there was one pie-shaped piece left to put into the top of the tank. That tank will hold 1.2 million gallons and provide water and better firefighting service to the better water pressure and firefighting service to the northeast corner of the city. Also, we looked at walked around. It was fun. Got to put on boots and hard hats and walk around the W Street water line, especially where it's crossing Campen Creek, and all of those excavations, and some of which was actually part of one of the consent item for tonight, to make sure that all of the plantings up there stay alive and that there's no excess silt and mud that goes into Campen Creek. On the 26th, I got to go out to the head of Salmon Creek. There's a private party who has been rescuing young of the year hatchlings of salmon and steelhead from Mill Creek up close to Dollar's Corners, up close to Battleground, and on up to where Mills Creek joins the east fork of the Lewis, just east of La Center. The problem with Mill Creek is that it runs out of water and it gets much too warm. Salmon fry will die almost instantly in 80-degree water. The rough rule of thumb is 50% mortality in 72 hours in 72-degree water. So warm water is a killer. But he's been rescuing these fish and raising them in a spring-fed pond that he has on his own property. And in the meantime, the Lower Columbia Fish Enhancement Group and some other people got together and reclaimed a pond which exists up there. It had existed until '96 when it was filled in by a flood. So they dug out the pond, created a new pond, and added some gravel and some woody debris to create shade and shelter for the fish. And then we got to go up there and put these hatchlings into that pond. It's spring-fed, it's 56 degrees, 56-degree water year-round, and it's up at the head of Salmon Creek. At this point, there are about 150 salmon a year that come up Salmon Creek. And by reestablishing these small raising areas and shelter areas, and also providing nutrients into the stream for the next half dozen years or so, the expectation, or the hope really, is that we will have hundreds of salmon and hundreds of steelhead in Salmon Creek. There's not really any chance we'll get back to the historic numbers, but it's a big deal. And then I also wanted to mention that the Camas-Washougal Economic Development Agency had a Chamber of Commerce after hours event last Thursday up at Town Square in their offices and the boardroom up there. It was very well attended. I think all of us were probably about 3 times as many people there as we expected. And I understand from Paul Dennis, the executive director, that there were at least 3 new leads that were generated for business expansions or new businesses coming to town as a result of talking to people who were at that event. So that was exciting. That's it.
Thank you. Any other items from council? Okay, I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.